In the summer of 1939, while newspapers across Europe filled their front pages with reports of diplomatic crises, military mobilization, and Adolf Hitler's increasingly aggressive demands, a quieter war plan was already taking shape inside government offices in London. It did not involve massed armies crossing borders or fleets exchanging broadsides in the North Sea. There would be no dramatic charge across battlefields or surprise invasion of enemy territory. Instead, British planners intended to fight with something far less spectacular, but potentially far more devastating. Their objective was simple: isolate Germany from the global economy and slowly deprive its factories, its military, and even its civilians of the resources needed to continue the war. If the plan succeeded, Britain believed Germany could be weakened to the point where victory became impossible without firing a single shot on land. The strategy was not new. For centuries, Britain had relied upon the sea as its greatest weapon. Unlike continental powers, whose strength often rested upon large standing armies, Britain possessed something few nations could match: the Royal Navy. Protected by the English Channel and commanding one of the world's largest merchant fleets, Britain had developed a strategy based on controlling global trade. Whenever war erupted, British naval power allowed London to interrupt commerce, intercept shipping, and isolate enemy economies from overseas resources. This approach had proven effective against Napoleon during the early 19th century. It had also played a major role during the First World War. Many British leaders believed it could work again. Their confidence rested upon geography. Germany possessed powerful industries, skilled engineers, and one of Europe's strongest armies. Yet the country lacked many essential raw materials. Modern industrial warfare required enormous quantities of imported goods, oil-powered vehicles and aircraft. Natural rubber kept trucks and tanks moving. Copper produced electrical wiring. Nickel strengthened steel. Tin, tungsten, bauxite, manganese, cotton, and countless other materials arrived from overseas. Germany produced some of these resources domestically. Many remained unavailable within its own borders. International trade filled the gap. British planners intended to close it. The Ministry of Economic Warfare began examining Germany's dependence upon imported resources long before the shooting started. Economists, naval officers, intelligence specialists, and trade experts studied shipping routes connecting Germany to the rest of the world. They compiled detailed records identifying which countries supplied essential materials. They calculated annual import requirements. They estimated stockpiles. Every cargo entering German ports became part of an enormous intelligence picture. The objective was remarkably ambitious. Rather than defeating Germany solely through military operations, Britain hoped to attack the foundation supporting Germany's war machine. Ships became the battlefield, cargoes became the targets. International commerce became another front in the coming conflict. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Britain declared war 2 days later. Within hours, the Royal Navy activated plans that had been prepared months earlier. Warships sailed toward designated patrol areas. Merchant vessels received new sailing instructions. Naval intelligence officers began monitoring commercial traffic across the Atlantic, the North Sea, and other strategic waterways. Unlike dramatic fleet engagements, much of the blockade depended upon patience. British cruisers, destroyers, and armed merchant cruisers established patrol lines through which neutral shipping frequently passed. Whenever a suspicious vessel appeared, signals ordered it to stop. Boarding parties crossed by small boat. Cargo manifests underwent careful inspection. Destination ports received close examination. If officers suspected prohibited goods might eventually reach Germany, the ship could be diverted into a British-controlled harbour for further investigation. This system became known as contraband control. The name sounded technical. Its effects could be enormous. International law traditionally distinguished between ordinary commercial goods and materials directly supporting military operations. Food occupied a particularly controversial position. Weapons obviously qualified as contraband. Machine tools often did as well. But what about grain, fertilizer, animal feed, cotton, wool, rubber? Modern industrial warfare blurred these distinctions. Almost every resource possessed military value. The British government gradually expanded its definition of contraband as the war progressed. Items previously considered harmless increasingly fell under naval inspection. Neutral nations occasionally protested. British officials defended the policy as essential for national survival. The blockade depended upon more than simply stopping individual ships. It required detailed knowledge of global commerce, British intelligence built enormous databases tracking shipping companies, cargo owners, insurers, exporters and importers. Officials examined financial transactions. Commercial correspondence attracted attention. Insurance documents sometimes revealed intended destinations differing from those listed officially. Merchants attempting to disguise cargo soon discovered Britain's economic intelligence network extended far beyond the Royal Navy itself. Banks, customs officials, diplomats, and commercial analysts all contributed information. The blockade became an immense administrative effort involving thousands of people. One of Britain's greatest advantages lay in geography. The North Sea provided relatively limited access to German ports, ships entering from the Atlantic frequently passed areas where Royal Navy patrols operated effectively. The English Channel also remained under British influence despite obvious dangers from German aircraft and submarines. Merchant captains understood that reaching Germany without inspection would prove extremely difficult. Many therefore avoided attempting direct deliveries altogether. Instead, Germany increasingly relied upon trade through neighboring neutral countries. This development introduced new complications. Nations such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland maintained neutrality during the early stages of the war. International law protected their right to conduct legitimate commerce. Britain therefore faced a delicate challenge. It needed to restrict German imports without driving neutral governments toward Berlin. Diplomacy became almost as important as naval operations. British negotiators worked tirelessly. Trade agreements limited exports. Financial incentives encouraged cooperation. Economic pressure supplemented diplomacy whenever necessary. The blockade rarely relied solely upon force. Perhaps no resource concerned British planners more than iron ore. Germany possessed iron deposits, but domestic production failed to satisfy industrial demand. High quality ore imported from Sweden played an essential role in steel manufacturing. Steel formed the backbone of modern warfare. Tanks, ships, artillery, railway tracks, factory machinery. Without reliable steel production, Germany's military strength would gradually decline. British strategists therefore paid close attention to Swedish exports during winter. Much Swedish iron ore travelled through the Norwegian port of Narvik because Baltic ports often froze. This route attracted intense interest. If Britain could interrupt these shipments, German steel production might suffer serious consequences. Discussions within the British government grew increasingly heated. Some officials advocated mining Norwegian waters. Others proposed occupying strategic Norwegian ports before Germany acted. These ideas remained controversial because Norway maintained neutrality. Violating that neutrality risked international criticism. Yet, allowing uninterrupted iron ore shipments strengthened Germany. The dilemma demonstrated how economic warfare often produced difficult political choices. Every decision carried strategic consequences, extending far beyond commercial trade. Meanwhile, Germany anticipated many of Britain's intentions. The memory of the First World War remained vivid. During that conflict, the British blockade had contributed significantly to severe shortages across Germany. Food became scarce, industrial production suffered, civilian hardship increased steadily. German leaders blamed blockade for weakening national resistance during the final years of the war. Adolf Hitler repeatedly referred to those experiences. He insisted Germany must never again become vulnerable to economic strangulation. Long before 1939, Nazi planners sought greater economic self-sufficiency. Synthetic fuel programs attempted reducing dependence upon imported oil. Artificial rubber factories produced substitutes for natural rubber. Chemical industries developed replacement materials whenever possible. Agricultural policies encouraged increased domestic food production. The concept became known as autarky. Economic independence taught in theory. Germany would produce everything necessary for war within territories it controlled. Reality proved considerably more complicated. Synthetic fuel required enormous industrial investment. Artificial rubber remained expensive. Domestic agriculture could not eliminate dependence upon imported animal feed and fertilizers. Many strategic metals simply did not exist in sufficient quantities inside Germany. Not in a amount of political determination could manufacture natural resources absent beneath the ground. Trade remained essential. The British understood this perfectly. Economic analysts estimated precisely how long German stockpiles might last under different conditions. Some materials appeared plentiful, others looked dangerously limited. Certain rare metals supported specialized manufacturing. Once exhausted, replacing them would become extremely difficult. Oil represented an especially serious concern. Although Germany invested heavily in synthetic fuel production from coal, output remained insufficient for prolonged large-scale warfare. Imports continued filling the gap. Cutting those imports promised long-term strategic benefits. The Royal Navy expanded patrol operations steadily. Older cruisers joined newly armed merchant vessels. Naval reservists returned to service. Boarding procedures became increasingly efficient. Experienced inspection teams quickly learned how merchants attempted concealing prohibited cargoes, false documentation, misleading destination ports, transfers between neutral vessels, complex ownership arrangements. Every method received careful attention. The blockade gradually evolved into a sophisticated contest between British inspectors and international traders seeking profit despite wartime restrictions. Not every merchant attempted violating the blockade deliberately. Many simply wished to continue ordinary commercial activity. War complicated everything. Cargoes legally destined for neutral countries sometimes later crossed into Germany. British officials therefore monitored entire supply chains rather than individual voyages alone. This required extraordinary administrative effort. Warehouses, railway shipments, border crossings, commercial invoices. Everything mattered. The blockade became one of history's largest exercises in economic intelligence. German officials searched continuously for ways around these restrictions. Neutral ports assumed growing importance. Small coastal vessels transferred cargoes. Railways carried imported materials across borders. Commercial front companies disguised transactions. Diplomatic negotiations sought additional trading opportunities. The contest resembled an enormous game of strategy played across continents. Each British restriction produced German adaptations. Each German adaptation generated new British countermeasures. Neither side relied solely upon naval strength. Information proved equally valuable. British cryptographers, commercial analysts, and intelligence officers increasingly cooperated. Reports from diplomats merged with customs records. Captured shipping documents revealed unexpected trade patterns. Insurance statistics highlighted unusual commercial activity. The resulting picture allowed officials to identify weaknesses within Germany's supply network. Sometimes intercepting only a handful of cargoes created disproportionate effects because specific industries depended upon rare imported materials. Economic warfare rewarded careful analysis rather than dramatic action. Ordinary civilians rarely noticed these invisible battles. No explosions accompanied successful inspections. No dramatic headlines announced another merchant vessel diverted into harbor. Yet every intercepted cargo represented machinery left unfinished, fuel unavailable for military operations, or industrial production delayed somewhere inside Germany. British leaders believed such cumulative pressure would eventually become overwhelming. The blockade also reflected Britain's broader strategic position during the opening months of the war. Unlike Germany, Britain could still draw upon a worldwide empire and extensive maritime connections. Merchant ships arrived from Canada carrying grain. Australia exported wool. India supplied raw materials. African colonies contributed minerals. Trade routes stretched across every ocean. Protecting those routes remained vital. Destroying Germany's axis while preserving Britain's own became the central challenge. The Royal Navy therefore fought two interconnected campaigns simultaneously. One protected allied commerce. The other disrupted Germany's success required both. As autumn turned into winter, the blockade tightened steadily. More ships underwent inspection. Lists of prohibited goods expanded. Economic intelligence improved. Neutral governments faced increasing diplomatic pressure regarding exports to Germany. Inside Berlin, officials watched these developments with growing concern. The war itself had barely begun, yet Britain was already attempting to repeat the strategy that had helped exhaust Germany during the First World War. Hitler remained confident that rapid military victories would make the blockade irrelevant. But British planners were thinking in far longer terms. They believed that every intercepted cargo, every delayed shipment, and every denied import quietly weakened Germany's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. The real test would come not in weeks or even months, but over years, as both nations discovered whether industrial strength, global trade, and control of the seas could prove as decisive as armies on the battlefield. By the spring of 1940, it had become increasingly clear that Britain and Germany were fighting two very different kinds of war. German newspapers celebrated rapid military victories. Poland had fallen within weeks. Armored divisions demonstrated a style of warfare the world had never seen before. Tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry appeared unstoppable. To many observers, Britain's strategy of inspecting merchant ships and restricting international trade seemed painfully slow by comparison. Critics questioned whether paperwork, naval patrols, and economic regulations could possibly compete with the speed of blitzkrieg. Yet inside Whitehall, British officials remained convinced that time favored the blockade. Every month Germany remained cut off from world markets brought the Reich closer to a crisis that battlefield victories alone could not solve. The greatest challenge facing Britain involved maintaining pressure without violating international law so aggressively that neutral nations turned against London. This required extraordinary diplomatic skill. Countries such as Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and several South American nations continued conducting international trade. Britain needed many of these governments to remain friendly. Open confrontation risked driving them toward Germany. Instead of relying entirely upon threats, British officials increasingly combined diplomacy with economic incentives. Trade agreements became powerful weapons. Britain offered to purchase strategic materials directly from neutral exporters rather than allowing tungsten, iron ore, or industrial metals to reach Germany. London simply bought them first. Sometimes the British government paid prices well above normal market value. The objective was not profit. The objective was denial. Every shipment purchased by Britain became one less shipment available to Germany. Officials jokingly referred to this policy as buying commodities only to lock them away. Behind the humour lay serious strategy. An unused warehouse in Britain proved far more valuable than a factory in Germany receiving those materials. The Ministry of Economic Warfare gradually expanded these purchasing programs across Europe and beyond. Portuguese tungsten attracted particular attention. The metal played a critical role in manufacturing armor-piercing ammunition and specialized cutting tools used throughout heavy industry. Germany depended heavily upon imports because domestic supplies remained extremely limited. British negotiators therefore worked relentlessly to reduce German access. Sometimes negotiations succeeded peacefully, at other times they became intense diplomatic contests involving competing financial offers from Berlin and London. Neutral governments suddenly found themselves balancing commercial opportunity against political pressure from both sides. Economic warfare extended into every corner of international diplomacy. Meanwhile, another strategic concern demanded immediate attention. Norway, the long Norwegian coastline stretched deep into the North Atlantic. More importantly, the port of Narvik remained ice-free throughout winter. From there, Swedish iron ore reached Germany despite seasonal conditions affecting Baltic ports. British intelligence carefully monitored these shipments. Every convoy represented steel for German tanks, artillery, submarines, and factories. Several senior British leaders argued that simply inspecting merchant vessels no longer sufficed. The route itself had to be interrupted. Discussions within the British War Cabinet became increasingly urgent. Some advocated laying naval mines inside Norwegian coastal waters. Others proposed occupying key ports before Germany could react. The proposals carried enormous political risks. Norway remained neutral, violating that neutrality might alienate world opinion. Yet allowing unrestricted ore shipments strengthened Germany's war economy. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain hesitated. The government searched for solutions balancing military necessity with diplomatic consequences. Germany reached its own conclusion first. On April 9, 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Operation Weserübung shocked much of the world. Hitler understood exactly why Norway mattered. Control of the Norwegian coast protected Swedish iron ore shipments. It also expanded German naval and air operations into the North Atlantic. The invasion demonstrated that economic warfare influenced military strategy far more than many observers realized. Norway was not conquered merely for territorial expansion. Its resources and sea routes formed part of the larger struggle over Germany's economic survival. Britain responded with military intervention. Royal Navy warships entered Norwegian waters. British, French, and Polish troops landed at several locations. Fierce fighting followed, although the campaign ultimately ended in a light withdrawal. The broader strategic lesson remained unmistakable. Economic resources could determine military campaigns. Control of trade routes mattered almost as much as control of battlefields. Even after Germany occupied Norway, Britain's blockade continued adapting. The Royal Navy intensified patrols farther west. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft searched constantly for merchant traffic attempting to reach occupied Europe. Intelligence officers examined every available shipping record. The struggle became one of persistence rather than dramatic victories. The blockade also forced Germany into increasingly complex commercial arrangements. Direct overseas imports became dangerous. Instead, Germany relied more heavily upon rail connections with neighboring countries. Neutral ports unloaded cargoes before transferring goods inland by train. Commercial intermediaries disguised final destinations. Financial transactions passed through multiple banks. Each additional step complicated British efforts. It also increased costs, delays, and inefficiency for Germany. Nothing moved as easily as before the war. British intelligence expanded accordingly. Commercial analysts tracked imports entering neutral countries. If Swedish purchases of rubber suddenly exceeded domestic requirements, investigators asked why. If Swiss industries imported unusually large quantities of copper despite stable production levels, officials examined the possibility of re-export to Germany. Statistical analysis became one of Britain's most valuable weapons. Numbers often revealed hidden trade patterns more effectively than espionage alone. Economists worked beside naval officers. Accountants contributed alongside intelligence agents. The blockade relied upon information as much as warships. One remarkable innovation involved the creation of comprehensive commodity control systems. British officials attempted monitoring virtually every important raw material entering European trade. Lists expanded continuously. Machine tools, industrial chemicals, precision bearings, electrical components, lubricants, cotton, other pharmaceutical ingredients. Almost any product capable of supporting Germany's war effort eventually attracted official attention. This enormous bureaucracy demanded extraordinary organization. Thousands of civil servants examined paperwork that most civilians never noticed: shipping manifests, insurance certificates, import licenses, warehouse inventories, bank records. Every document potentially revealed another path around the blockade. Not every British official agreed on every aspect of the strategy. Some argued that restrictions should become even harsher. Others warned excessive pressure might damage Britain's own economy or alienate important trading partners. Debates continued throughout the war. Yet nearly everyone accepted the central principle. Germany's industrial strength depended upon resources unavailable within its own borders. Reducing access remained strategically worthwhile. Inside Germany, the effects appeared gradually rather than dramatically. Factory managers began reporting shortages of certain imported materials. Production schedules required constant adjustment. Substitutes replaced unavailable components whenever possible. Engineers redesigned products to conserve scarce resources. Recycling programs expanded. Old metal products underwent collection and processing. Nothing useful could be wasted. Nazi propaganda naturally minimized these problems. Official broadcasts emphasized military victories rather than economic challenges. Privately, however, industrial planners recognized growing difficulties. Every new restriction complicated production. Every interrupted shipment forced additional improvisation. The German economy proved remarkably adaptable. Synthetic fuel production increased. Chemical industries manufactured artificial rubber. Scientists developed replacement materials for numerous imported goods. These achievements impressed even British analysts. Yet adaptation carried costs. Synthetic fuel required vast quantities of coal, electricity, labor, and industrial equipment. Artificial substitutes often performed less effectively than natural materials. Factories devoted to replacement products could not simultaneously manufacture tanks or aircraft. Autarky reduced vulnerability, but never eliminated it. Britain considered these inefficiencies victories in themselves. Every additional hour German workers spent producing synthetic substitutes represented time unavailable elsewhere. Economic warfare rarely achieved immediate collapse. Instead, it steadily increased the resources Germany required simply to maintain existing production. Efficiency declined, costs rose, flexibility disappeared. The cumulative burden grew year after year. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy faced its own mounting challenge. Germany responded to the blockade with unrestricted submarine warfare. If Britain depended upon maritime trade, then attacking British merchant shipping offered obvious retaliation. The Battle of the Atlantic intensified rapidly. German U-boats attempted severing the supply route sustaining Britain itself. Convoys crossing the Atlantic encountered increasing danger. Merchant ships burned. Cargoes disappeared beneath the waves. British civilians soon experienced rationing as imported food and raw materials became harder to deliver safely. The struggle therefore evolved into two simultaneous blockades. Britain sought isolating Germany. Germany attempted starving Britain through submarine attacks. Both sides understood that industrial warfare depended fundamentally upon logistics. Factories required raw materials, cities required food, armies required fuel. Control of the oceans determined whether those necessities arrived. The Royal Navy gradually refined the convoy system. Merchant ships sailed together under naval escort, destroyers hunted submarines, corvettes protected vulnerable cargo vessels, aircraft extended patrol coverage farther into the Atlantic, radar, sonar, and improved intelligence steadily strengthened Allied defenses. Protecting Britain's own imports became inseparable from denying Germany access to overseas trade. One campaign could not succeed without the other. The blockade also extended into finance. British authorities froze German overseas assets wherever possible. Commercial transactions involving German companies encountered increasing restrictions. Insurance markets became difficult to access. International banking grew more complicated. Global commerce relied heavily upon trust, credit, and financial institutions centered in London and New York. Britain exploited these advantages relentlessly, even when cargoes physically existed. Arranging payment, insurance, and transportation became increasingly difficult for German importers. Mutual businessmen often concluded that trading with Germany involved excessive legal and financial risk. Many simply chose alternative markets. The cumulative effect slowly isolated the German economy from international commerce. Historians sometimes describe this period as an invisible campaign because ordinary soldiers rarely witnessed its daily operations. No frontline correspondents reported customs inspections. No famous photographs captured economists analyzing shipping statistics. Yet behind the scenes, thousands of officials fought a relentless administrative war that influenced every factory, every railway, and every military depot inside Germany. Each intercepted shipment, each successful diplomatic agreement, each denied export license represented another small reduction in Germany's economic strength. None appeared decisive individually. Together, they formed one of Britain's most ambitious strategic offensives. By the end of 1940, Hitler had conquered much of Western Europe, but one objective remained stubbornly out of reach. Britain refused to surrender, and the Royal Navy still controlled the sea lanes connecting the world economy. Germany had won spectacular victories on land, yet the blockade continued tightening month after month, forcing German planners to search constantly for new sources of oil, metals, food, and industrial materials. It was becoming increasingly apparent that conquering territory alone could not solve the Reich's economic problems. To truly break Britain's strategy, Hitler would need either to defeat Britain outright or seize enough new resources elsewhere to overcome the blockade's growing pressure. That search for resources would soon influence one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war, the invasion of the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler had reached a conclusion that would shape the remainder of the war. Britain had refused every opportunity to negotiate. The Luftwaffe had failed to force the island into submission during the Battle of Britain. The Royal Navy continued controlling the oceans despite relentless U-boat attacks. Most importantly, the economic blockade remained firmly in place. Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Yet British warships still intercepted cargoes, restricted international trade, and slowly tightened the economic pressure that Berlin had hoped to escape through military victory. If Britain could not be defeated directly, Hitler believed Germany needed something even more valuable than another military victory. It needed resources on a scale large enough to overcome the blockade itself. That belief pointed east. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, certainly reflected Hitler's ideological ambitions. He viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's greatest future enemy. He desired territorial expansion. He sought what Nazi ideology called living space. Yet, economic considerations proved equally important. German planners examined Soviet territory not simply as land to conquer, but as a warehouse of raw materials. Ukraine offered vast agricultural production. The Donbas contained coal. The Caucasus promised enormous oil reserves. Forests, iron ore, manganese, and other strategic resources appeared capable of transforming Germany's economic position. If Germany controlled these assets, the British blockade might become largely irrelevant. The calculations seemed convincing on paper. If Germany possessed Ukrainian grain, millions of civilians and soldiers could be fed without overseas imports. If Romanian oil combined with Caucasus petroleum, fuel shortages might disappear. If Soviet industry fell into German hands, production capacity would expand dramatically. The blockade depended upon Germany lacking resources. Conquer enough territory, Hitler believed, and Britain would lose its greatest strategic weapon. British intelligence understood these possibilities. Officials inside the Ministry of Economic Warfare carefully monitored German preparations before the invasion. Economic analysts examined railway construction, fuel shipments, industrial production, agricultural planning. The evidence suggested Germany expected a rapid campaign. Only a swift victory would provide immediate access to Soviet resources. A prolonged war would create entirely different problems. The farther German armies advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Every kilometer required additional fuel. Every captured city demanded occupation forces. Every destroyed railway required repairs. The very campaign intended to solve Germany's economic problems threatened to create new logistical burdens. Initially, German victories appeared spectacular. Entire Soviet armies became encircled. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners surrendered. Cities fell rapidly. European observers again wondered whether Britain's slow economic strategy could possibly compete with Blitzkrieg. German propaganda confidently predicted complete victory before winter. Inside London, however, British officials remained cautious. They had learned not to judge the blockade's success by dramatic headlines. The important question remained unchanged. Could Germany transform military conquest into sustainable economic strength? The answer proved far more difficult than expected. Soviet forces adopted a scorched earth policy wherever possible. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. Railway equipment disappeared. Food supplies were destroyed. Oil facilities suffered sabotage. Agricultural machinery vanished. German armies frequently captured territory stripped of much of its immediate economic value. The British blockade therefore continued exerting pressure. Germany gained land faster than it gained usable resources. Oil remained perhaps the greatest disappointment. German planners had expected eventual access to the Caucasus fields. Instead, Soviet resistance delayed the advance. The critical oil centers remained beyond German reach. Meanwhile, military operations themselves consumed enormous quantities of fuel. Thousands of trucks, tanks, aircraft, and support vehicles required constant resupply. Synthetic fuel factories worked continuously. Romanian oil production reached maximum capacity. Demand still exceeded supply. British analysts recognized the growing contradiction. The campaign intended to solve Germany's fuel problem was making that problem worse. Agriculture presented similar difficulties. Ukraine possessed extraordinary fertile farmland. Harvesting crops during wartime proved another matter entirely. Labor shortages emerged. Transportation networks remained damaged. Storage facilities had been destroyed. Partisan attacks complicated distribution. Moving food from occupied territory to Germany required functioning railways, trucks, and security forces. Each element consumed additional resources. The British blockade indirectly magnified every logistical challenge. Replacement equipment became harder to obtain. Imported machinery remained scarce. Fertilizer production suffered from competing industrial priorities. Food certainly reached Germany from occupied territories. It never achieved the abundance planners had originally envisioned. Meanwhile, Britain steadily expanded another aspect of economic warfare. Strategic bombing. At first glance, bombing campaigns and naval blockades appeared unrelated. In reality, they increasingly supported one another. The blockade restricted Germany's access to imported raw materials. Bombing destroyed factories attempting to process the materials already available. Railway yards burned. Power stations suffered repeated attacks. Synthetic fuel plants became major targets. Every bomb multiplied the effects of the blockade. Every shortage created by the blockade increased the impact of bombing. The two strategies gradually merged into one comprehensive campaign against Germany's economy. The United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. American participation transformed Britain's blockade. The world's largest industrial economy now joined the effort. American naval forces strengthened Atlantic patrols. American industry produced enormous quantities of escort vessels. Financial cooperation expanded dramatically. Economic restrictions became increasingly global. Neutral countries discovered that access to American and British markets mattered far more than commerce with Germany. The blockade therefore gained unprecedented international influence. Trade routes narrowed further, financial isolation deepened, industrial shortages accumulated. One particularly effective weapon involved intelligence. British codebreakers achieved remarkable success against German communications. Although many of these achievements remained secret throughout the war, they provided invaluable insight into Germany's economic condition, requests for fuel, complaints regarding transportation, factory production reports, railway delays, military supply shortages. Together, they revealed an economy operating under steadily increasing strain. The information allowed British planners to identify vulnerable industries requiring additional pressure. Economic warfare became increasingly precise, rather than restricting everything equally. Britain focused greater attention upon materials Germany found most difficult to replace. Ball bearings became famous after bombing campaigns targeted factories producing them, yet countless less familiar materials attracted equal attention: molybdenum, vanadium, nickel, high-grade lubricants, industrial diamonds, precision machine tools, certain chemicals. The loss of even relatively small quantities sometimes disrupted entire production lines. Modern industry depended upon intricate supply chains. Breaking one critical link often halted everything else. Germany searched constantly for alternatives. Scientists developed substitute materials, factories redesigned products, captured equipment underwent recycling. Old metal objects disappeared into collection drives. Civilian households surrendered cooking pots, fences, and other metal goods. Schoolchildren collected scrap. Every available resource entered the war economy. These efforts demonstrated impressive organization. They also illustrated the growing pressure created by the blockade. No nation willingly melts household possessions into raw materials unless shortages have become serious. Transportation emerged as another increasingly severe challenge. Even when Germany obtained necessary resources, moving them efficiently became progressively harder. The railway system carried enormous burdens: coal, steel, food, fuel, troops, ammunition, replacement machinery. Everything competed for limited transportation capacity. Bombing destroyed bridges and marshalling yards. Locomotives suffered repeated attacks. Replacement rails required steel already in short supply. The blockade magnified every disruption by restricting access to imported replacement materials. German logistics officers often solved one problem only to encounter another. The cumulative burden steadily increased. Inside occupied Europe, resistance movements quietly supported Britain's economic strategy. Railway sabotage delayed shipments. Bridges exploded, warehouses burned, telephone lines disappeared. Although individual operations appeared small, together they disrupted Germany's ability to exploit conquered territories fully. The blockade depended upon preventing efficient resource movement. Resistance activities reinforced that objective from within occupied Europe itself. The contest increasingly resembled an enormous web: naval patrols at sea, diplomats negotiating with neutral governments, economists studying trade statistics, intelligence officers analyzing communications, resistance fighters destroying railways, bomber crews attacking factories. Each contributed differently toward the same strategic goal: reduce Germany's capacity to wage industrial war. No single action achieved decisive results alone. Together, they steadily transformed Germany's economic situation. German civilian life reflected these pressures. Rationing expanded. Consumer goods became scarcer. Replacement clothing proved harder to obtain. Household products disappeared from shops. Government propaganda emphasized sacrifice for victory. Most civilians accepted hardship as part of wartime life. Few fully appreciated how much Britain's blockade contributed to these shortages. Unlike bombing, economic warfare remained largely invisible. Ships intercepted hundreds of kilometers away rarely attracted attention inside German cities. Yet, missing imports eventually affected everyday existence. Military production received priority whenever possible. Civilian consumption absorbed most shortages first. Nevertheless, even armaments industries increasingly encountered difficulties. Tank production depended upon specialized alloys. Aircraft required aluminum, rubber, and high-octane fuel. Naval construction demanded steel and complex machinery. Every shortage forced difficult choices. Should available fuel train pilots or support armored divisions? Should scarce steel build submarines or tanks? Should railway capacity transport coal or food? The blockade ensured such decisions became increasingly unavoidable. By the end of 1942, Hitler's expectation that conquest alone would neutralize Britain's economic strategy had clearly failed. Germany controlled more territory than any European power in generations, yet its dependence upon scarce resources had not disappeared. Instead, the war itself consumed those resources faster than the expanding empire could reliably provide them. Britain's blockade remained intact, now strengthened by American industrial power, growing strategic bombing campaigns, and an increasingly sophisticated intelligence network. The contest had entered its decisive phase. Germany still possessed formidable military strength, but beneath the victories and defeats reported from the front, an invisible struggle over oil, steel, food, transportation, and industrial production was steadily shifting the balance of the entire war. By 1943, the outcome of the economic war was becoming increasingly difficult for Germany to hide. The British blockade had never produced the sudden collapse that some optimistic planners had imagined during the opening months of the conflict. Instead, it had achieved something far more significant. It had slowly forced Germany into a permanent state of shortage, where every military success demanded resources that became harder to replace, and every new offensive placed additional strain upon an economy already operating at its limits. The blockade had become a weapon measured not in days or weeks, but in years. Every intercepted cargo, every restricted export, every disrupted shipping route, and every denied shipment had accumulated into a pressure that even Germany's remarkable industrial organization struggled to overcome. The transformation became especially clear in Germany's fuel situation. Oil had always represented one of the Reich's greatest weaknesses. Synthetic fuel plants continued operating around the clock, converting coal into gasoline and aviation fuel. German chemists achieved extraordinary technical success. The process worked. The problem was scale. Synthetic production consumed enormous amounts of electricity, labor, machinery, and coal. Even at maximum output, it rarely satisfied military demand. Romanian oil fields helped fill the gap, but they could not solve the problem entirely. SLI bombing campaigns increasingly targeted synthetic fuel plants during 1944. The British blockade magnified the damage. Germany could not simply replace destroyed production by importing petroleum from overseas. The sea routes remained closed. Every bomb dropped on a fuel refinery became far more devastating because alternative supplies no longer existed. The Luftwaffe experienced the consequences almost immediately. Aircraft factories continued producing fighters. Many airfields still possessed experienced mechanics. Pilots remained willing to fight. Increasingly, there was simply not enough aviation fuel to keep aircraft in the air. Training hours were reduced dramatically. Replacement pilots graduated with fewer flying hours than at any previous point in the war. Veteran commanders repeatedly warned that courage alone could not compensate for inadequate training. Modern fighter combat demanded constant practice. The blockade had quietly helped create a situation in which Germany possessed airplanes that could not be flown often enough to remain effective. The German army encountered similar difficulties. Armored divisions depended upon mobility. Tanks without fuel became stationary artillery. Supply trucks stopped moving. Artillery ammunition reached the front more slowly. Food deliveries became unreliable. Entire operations required postponement until fuel reserves accumulated. Commanders increasingly found themselves planning campaigns around logistical limitations rather than purely military objectives. The blockade had transformed fuel into one of Germany's most precious strategic resources. Transportation throughout the Reich also continued deteriorating. Years of heavy military traffic had worn down the railway network. Bombing campaigns destroyed bridges, rail junctions, and repair facilities. Replacement rails, locomotives, and machinery required steel and industrial equipment already in short supply. Every interruption delayed military shipments. Coal accumulated at mines because trains could not move it efficiently. Factories slowed production while waiting for raw materials. Completed weapons sometimes remained in warehouses because transportation had broken down. Economic warfare rarely produced dramatic headlines. Instead, it quietly interrupted thousands of small processes that together sustained the entire war effort. British officials closely monitored these developments. The Ministry of Economic Warfare collected reports from intelligence officers, diplomats, resistance organizations, commercial analysts, and military planners. The information revealed a pattern becoming increasingly consistent. Germany still possessed enormous industrial capacity. The problem lay in connecting every part of that industrial system efficiently. Raw materials failed to arrive. Finished products could not be transported. Fuel remained unavailable. Workers lost time because machinery lacked replacement components. No single shortage proved fatal. Their combined effect steadily reduced Germany's ability to wage modern industrial war, one often overlooked achievement of the blockade involved forcing Germany into economic choices it never wanted to make. Every nation possesses limited resources under ideal conditions. Those resources can be allocated according to long-term strategic priorities. Germany gradually lost that flexibility. Steel intended for new factories instead repaired bond damage. Coal designated for industry-fueled synthetic fuel plants. Railway capacity scheduled for commercial shipments transported emergency military supplies. Engineers abandoned ambitious development projects because essential materials no longer existed. The blockade rarely destroyed resources directly. It forced Germany to spend existing resources merely maintaining the system already in place. The distinction proved enormously important. Meanwhile, neutral nations found it increasingly difficult to continue substantial trade with Germany. American participation after 1941 expanded Allied financial influence enormously. Governments considering exports to the Reich now risked losing access to British and American markets. For most countries, the choice became obvious. Commerce with the Allies promised long-term economic stability. Trade with Germany involved growing political and financial risks. British diplomacy, supported by naval power, steadily reduced Germany's opportunities for international commerce. Sweden gradually limited certain exports. Portugal eventually reduced tungsten shipments. Turkey curtailed deliveries of strategic minerals. Even countries attempting strict neutrality found themselves affected by the immense economic influence exercised by Britain and the United States. The blockade therefore extended far beyond the North Sea. It became a worldwide system of commercial pressure. Inside occupied Europe, Germany attempted extracting maximum economic value from conquered territories. Factories in France, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere produced equipment for the German military. Agricultural regions exported food. Industrial machinery underwent relocation. Forced labor programs transferred millions of workers into German factories. These measures undoubtedly strengthened the German economy in the short term, yet they never fully compensated for the loss of unrestricted access to world markets. Occupied territories themselves often depended upon imported raw materials before the war. Once international trade collapsed, even captured factories struggled with shortages. Resistance movements further complicated German exploitation. Railway sabotage became increasingly frequent. Warehouses burned, industrial equipment disappeared, communication networks suffered repeated disruption. Every successful act of resistance forced Germany to devote additional manpower toward security duties instead of military operations. The blockade indirectly amplified these effects by making replacement materials and machinery increasingly scarce. By 1944, the Allied armies had returned to Western Europe, but the Normandy landings opened another enormous front. From that point onward, Germany faced simultaneous crises. Ground offensives pressed from east and west. Strategic bombing intensified. The blockade remained firmly in place. Every military setback reduced Germany's ability to protect remaining industrial regions. Every lost territory eliminated additional resources. Every retreat shortened available time. The cumulative pressure became overwhelming. Perhaps the greatest evidence of the blockade's success appeared after the war. When Allied investigators examined German records, they discovered extensive documentation revealing constant concern over raw materials. Official memoranda discussed shortages of oil, rubber, copper, manganese, nickel, and numerous specialized industrial products. Factory managers repeatedly requested additional supplies that never arrived. Military planners debated fuel allocations before major offensives. Railway authorities complained about transportation bottlenecks. These documents confirmed what British analysts had suspected throughout the conflict. Germany had fought under growing economic constraints for years. Modern historians generally agree that the blockade alone could not have defeated Nazi Germany. The German economy proved far more resilient than many British planners expected in 1939. Occupation of much of Europe provided additional resources. Scientific innovation produced remarkable synthetic substitutes. Albert Speer's industrial reforms significantly increased armaments production despite worsening conditions. German engineers repeatedly demonstrated extraordinary adaptability. Yet historians also agree upon another crucial point. Without the blockade, Germany's industrial performance would almost certainly have been much stronger. The pressure created by Britain's economic strategy forced countless compromises that otherwise might never have existed. The blockade also demonstrated an important lesson about 20th century warfare. Modern conflicts depended upon far more than battlefield victories. Factories, shipping networks, international finance, agriculture, mining, transportation, and industrial chemistry all became weapons. Victory increasingly belonged not only to the nation possessing the strongest army, but also to the nation capable of sustaining that army year after year. Britain understood this reality earlier than many of its opponents. Unable to match Germany's army in size during the opening years of the war, Britain instead exploited its greatest traditional strength: control of the seas. The Royal Navy did not merely defend the British Isles.it controlled access to global commerce. That control allowed Britain to influence events thousands of miles away without occupying foreign territory. A merchant vessel intercepted in the Atlantic could affect a factory in the Ruhr months later. A diplomatic agreement signed in Lisbon or Stockholm might deny Germany a strategic metal needed for future weapons production. Economic warfare connected distant events into one enormous strategic system. The human dimension should not be forgotten. For ordinary German civilians, shortages gradually became part of everyday life. Ration books, substitute foods, worn clothing repaired repeatedly instead of replaced. Consumer goods disappearing from shops. Long before Germany's cities lay in ruins, many families had already experienced years of declining living standards. Military requirements always received priority, leaving civilians to absorb much of the economic burden. The blockade contributed significantly to those hardships, although its effects often blended with bombing damage and the enormous demands of total war. British civilians endured hardships as well. The Battle of the Atlantic brought rationing to Britain. German submarines sank thousands of Allied merchant ships. Food imports declined. Every convoy crossing the Atlantic involved enormous danger. The difference lay in outcome. Britain maintained its maritime lifeline despite terrible losses. Germany never broke the Allied supply system. Conversely, Germany failed to overcome Britain's blockade. One side successfully protected global commerce while restricting its enemies' access to it. That imbalance steadily shifted the economic balance of the war. Looking back across the entire conflict, the British blockade rarely receives the same attention as D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, or the Battle of Britain. It lacked dramatic moments easily captured in photographs or newsreels. There was no single decisive battle announcing its success. Instead, it unfolded quietly across oceans, ports, customs offices, banks, diplomatic negotiations, and government ministries. Yet its influence reached nearly every battlefield of the Second World War. It shaped Germany's search for oil in the Soviet Union, complicated industrial production, restricted access to vital raw materials, weakened transportation networks, and magnified the effects of Allied bombing, the British plan that nearly starved Germany without firing a shot was never about achieving quick victory. It was a strategy built upon patience, persistence, and the belief that modern war depended as much upon economics as armies. The Royal Navy, supported by diplomats, economists, intelligence officers, merchant sailors, and countless civil servants, transformed Britain's command of the seas into one of the most powerful strategic weapons of the entire conflict. Germany fought with remarkable determination, developed ingenious substitutes, and conquered vast territories in an effort to escape its dependence on overseas trade. But in the end, the blockade remained unbroken. Combined with Allied industrial power, strategic bombing, and military offensives on every front, it steadily deprived the Third Reich of the resources needed to continue the war. It was one of history's greatest demonstrations that sometimes the most decisive victories are achieved not through spectacular battles, but through the relentless control of supply, trade, and time itself.